If I, Aguirre, want the birds to drop dead from the trees, and the birds will drop dead from the trees. I'm the wrath of God.
Aguirre, The Wrath of God, is a film that by all reason never should have been completed, and yet it stands today as a critically acclaimed masterpiece thanks to the vision of one man, Werner Herzog, a man born to a family of Nazis in the middle of World War II, who almost died to parasites in North Africa, cooked and ate his own shoe in front of a live audience, pulled Joaquin Phoenix out of a burning car wreck, and was even shot in LA mid-interview.
Nobody cares about my films. For example, what's...
This is a man who has always been obsessed with doing the impossible, known most famously for hauling a 320-ton steamboat over a mountain in the middle of the jungle purely for the sake of the film Fitzcarraldo, putting countless people's lives in danger for a dream many considered completely deranged. And yet, he did it. He saw his dream come true. And it was that same dedication that produced Aguirre, his international breakout nobody believed in, and everything seemed to be against, that in spite of everything was able to become a true cult classic, widely considered to be among the greatest films of all time. Despite psychopath actors, life-threatening disasters, and constant brushes with death, he made his dream come true. This is the tale of how it all happened. This is his wrath of God. It was here in Munich, during a visit to a good friend, that Herzog's journey would begin. Whilst waiting for his friend to finish a phone call, he explored his library and chanced upon a children's book about adventurers and discoveries, opening it to find a short passage about the Spanish conquistador Lope de Aguirre and his ill-fated quest for the mythical city of El Dorado. Though it was just half a page long, the story captivated Herzog. Immediately, he rushed home and began to write his screenplay in a frenzy. Furiously, he worked away at his typewriter while on a 2.5-day road trip with his football team. Both on the bus and at the games, he typed away. But this would also be where he experienced his first setback. You see, as a gift for the opposing side, the team had brought plenty of beer kegs with them, but after opening them on the way, were completely drunk long before arriving at their destination. And when the team's drunken goalie leaned over his shoulder to see what Herzog was doing, he suddenly vomited all over the typewriter, completely ruining much of the screenplay so far. Herzog, unable to even recall what he had written, simply threw the ruined pages out the window and filled the gaps with new ideas. Despite the chaos, he'd done it. The screenplay was complete, and he knew just who to cast for the leading role. Klaus Kinski, one of the most deranged actors in cinema history.
Christus war, soviel ich weiß, duldsam. Und wenn ihm einer widersprochen hat, dann hat er versucht, ihn zu überzeugen, hat nicht gesagt, halt deine Schnauze.
Nein, er hat nicht gesagt, halt die Schnauze. Er hat eine Peitsche genommen und hat ihm in die Fresse gehauen. Das hat er gemacht. Du dumme Sau.
It was here at 3 Elizabeth Street in Munich that the pair first met. For in the 1950s, this was a boarding house where a 13-year-old Herzog lived with his mother and 2 brothers in just a single room. The much older Kinski lived nearby in an attic, without any furniture or belongings, but filled knee-deep with dead leaves, and walked around all day stark naked. Obviously, he was quite insane. However, The boarding house's elderly owner came from a family of artists herself, and took quite a liking to the struggling actor, bringing him in off the streets and into their home. This quite quickly proved to be a terrible mistake. Kinski was completely obsessed with his acting, and often for 10 hours straight, he would scream vocal exercises in his room, with a voice powerful enough to break glasses all around the apartment, and would fly into fits of rage for barely any reason whatsoever. One time, he ripped the door clean off its hinges just because the old woman who was giving him free accommodation, free food, and cleaning his laundry for him hadn't ironed his collars properly. At another point, he locked himself inside the communal bathroom for 2 straight days, completely obliterating everything inside until all the porcelain had been turned to dust. And in yet another incident, when a theatre critic came over to call Kinski's performances outstanding and extraordinary, Kinski threw his meal and cutlery in their face, stating that he was not excellent, he was not extraordinary, he was monumental, he was epochal. And after 3 months at the boarding house, the owner finally came to her senses and kicked him out. But it was enough to leave a deep impression on Herzog for the rest of his life. And later he would witness the results of Kinski's obsession when he finally saw him in the 1955 film Children, Mother and a General. Here Kinski has a minor role, with little screen time, but in just the short clip of him waking up, Herzog saw he had true talent, and therefore, over a decade after meeting him in that boarding house, he decided to send him the screenplay for Aguirre. Soon he would receive a response when he picked up a call at 3 AM in the morning to hear nothing but incoherent screaming. It took a couple minutes for him to realize it was Kinski, and even then it still took a full hour of Kinski ranting for him to finally realize that the madman actually loved the idea and deeply wanted to play the part of Aguirre. Therefore, they committed to go together on an odyssey into the deep reaches of the jungle, shooting the film chronologically as they adventured down the same treacherous rivers the real Aguirre had followed over 400 years ago. After all, trapped in the jungle with a diagnosed psychopath, what could go wrong? And so began pre-production. Over the next 9 months, Herzog worked tirelessly to assemble a crew, scout locations, and gather together the final members of the cast. From 16 different countries across both Europe and the Americas, he brought together scores of largely unknown actors. After all, with a tiny budget of just $370,000, a full third of which went just to Kinski's salary, he had to skimp wherever he could. He had scraped together this funding from a German TV station, making up the difference with his personal funds and a loan from his brother, in a deal that left him with virtually zero chance of any financial profit. This was instead an endeavor of pure stubbornness, and determined to make his vision a reality no matter what. He stole his camera from a Munich film school and hired mostly individuals with no prior acting experience. For example, the flute player seen throughout the film was simply a mentally handicapped beggar known as Hombrecito that Herzog had found on the streets of Cusco and taken a liking to. In his own words,
He was very much retarded, this man.
Additionally, he would also recruit hundreds of local Native Americans through their socialist cooperative. Arriving in their traditional costumes, they would bring the full expedition party up to an impressive 450 people. However, the crew itself was astoundingly small, consisting of just 8 members. At last though, everything seemed ready to begin shooting, but in the final days of location scouting, disaster struck in an event that would change Herzog's life forever. It's Christmas Eve, 1971, and at Jorge Chavez International Airport in Lima, Peru's bustling capital, everyone is ready to travel home and celebrate Christmas with their families in Pucallpa and Iquitos, cities deep in the Amazon jungle. Among them is a 17-year-old girl, Juliane Kopke, fresh out of high school and flying home with her mother to their home on a biological research station deep in the Amazon jungle. Also in the crowd was Werner Herzog. With no time for holidays, he was still working, and ready to do some more location scouting for where he might shoot his film. Both Kopke and Herzog had tickets to fly with Lanza, an airline infamous for its abysmal safety record. With a reputation for using car mechanics to repair their aircraft engines, and 2 prior catastrophic crashes to their name, Lanza was dirt cheap, and all that Herzog's shoestring budget could afford. But despite bribing an attendant at the counter to secure his seat, Herzog's reservation was abruptly cancelled at the last minute, leaving him stuck overnight in Lima. Meanwhile, it was Juliane, with 85 other passengers and 6 crew, that would leave on Lanza Flight 508, happy that they had been the lucky ones who would get to reunite with their families just in time for Christmas. The flight began smoothly with an ascent over the Andes to 6.4 kilometers above sea level, but it was there that they would encounter an area of severe turbulence and thunderstorms, with the situation quickly becoming perilous. The crew, however, desperate to maintain their packed holiday schedule, pressed forward regardless, in a miscalculation that would cost them their lives. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning would strike the plane's wing and ignite the fuel in its engine, creating a catastrophic explosion that sent the plane into a nosedive as it was ripped apart in the sky. Passengers, debris, and Christmas gifts for unknowing family would be scattered to the winds and across the jungle below. 91 lives were lost in the deadliest lightning strike in aviation history. But 92 had boarded the plane. Strapped to her seat, Juliane Kopke had plummeted nearly 3,000 meters into the dense jungle below. Miraculously, a combination of updrafts from the storm and the thick forest canopy below had managed to break her fall. She survived the crash with just a broken collarbone, a deep gash in her arm, eye injuries, and a concussion. Alone and injured, she drew on the skills her biologist parents had taught her to trek for 10 days through the unforgiving rainforest. Finally, she stumbled upon some local lumberjacks who rescued her and brought her back to civilization by canoe. Juliane's survival was heralded as a miracle, with news spreading throughout the world and inspiring the 1974 film Miracles Still Happen, which is a really bad movie. Juliane herself has stated her dislike of the film thanks to its continuous inaccuracies and the terrible actor portraying her.
Mami, hilf mir doch. Oh!
In fact, it wasn't until 27 years after the crash that Juliane finally agreed to recount her story on camera for Herzog's 1998 documentary, Wings of Hope. Herzog was deeply affected by the incident and had promised to one day return to tell her story, as perhaps the only filmmaker capable of doing so thanks to their special connection. The story was later made even more harrowing, with the discovery that as many as 14 other passengers also survived the initial crash, but all died waiting for help that never came. And at the exact same time that they and Juliane were fighting for their lives, just a few rivers away, Werner Herzog was fighting his own battle, against his urge to kill Klaus Kinski. Despite just narrowly avoiding disaster on Lanza Flight 508, Herzog still had a movie to make, but soon he might have found himself wishing he'd gone down with the plane. Filming was set to begin near Machu Picchu, then a rugged and undeveloped area, and initially the screenplay had featured a powerful opening scene on a glacier near the location, but this was later removed. Nonetheless, Despite being told as such, Klaus Kinski arrived in Peru with nearly half a ton of alpine equipment, including tents, sleeping bags, crampons, and ice axes, insisting that they would still need it. To appear in the film, he had just cut short his controversial Jesus tour, where he ranted his own interpretation of the New Testament, taking on the character of Jesus himself. The tour had become infamous, selling out venues across Germany as thousands gathered to heckle and watch him completely melt down live on stage.
Ich darf ein Zitat bringen, an den Werken sollt ihr sie erkennen. Das ist für mich entscheidend.
Many were glad to see the tour cut short, but upon arriving in Peru, it quickly became clear that Kinski was still in character. In his mind, he was a derided, misunderstood messiah, and went around acting as such, quickly making him completely unbearable to both the cast and crew. To keep him placated, he was given his own tent in conditions far better than everyone else. Yet when it rained and a little bit of water seeped in, he threw an apocalyptic tantrum. They upgraded the tent with an additional palm leaf roof, but he still wasn't satisfied, and eventually moved into the only hotel in the area, a small 8-room lodge near Machu Picchu. Meanwhile, Herzog lived in stark contrast to his leading star. The only house he could find was a single small hut, home to a local hunchbacked dwarf woman with 9 children and more than 100 guinea pigs infesting the place that would crawl all over him late into the night. Unable to sleep, he instead moved in with the extras into an old barn used for drying tea leaves, where they were cramped together trying to sleep on wooden planks and makeshift hammocks, surrounded by the damp chill of the highlands. By the last 2 chaotic days before shooting began, Herzog was forced to work day and night just to create some semblance of order in the production. Hoping to snatch just an hour of sleep before dawn, he asked the extras to wake him up for the train to their first shooting location. They didn't. Waking in a panic, Herzog would see the train leaving without him, his dream leaving him behind. In desperation, he sprinted barefoot down the tracks, just barely grabbing on before his bloodied feet failed him. It was a fitting start to the beginning of the real adventure, one that would risk all their lives as they delved deep into the unforgiving jungle with no idea of what truly lay ahead. The film opens on an ancient Incan staircase carved into the mountains near Machu Picchu. Along these steep, slippery and overgrown paths march over 400 actors with a procession of horses, pigs and llamas. An altitude of over 14,000 feet, where one misplaced foot meant certain death. Even many of the highland natives became sick with vertigo and had to be tied to the mountainside to be extracted later one by one. Despite their fear, Herzog led the expedition higher and higher up along a vertical drop of about 2,000 feet. Yet when they finally reached their destination, it was all for nothing. They were surrounded by a fog so thick they could only see just a few meters ahead of them. But suddenly, the clouds dissipated and daylight broke through in a miracle that allowed him to achieve his dream shot of the tiny line of actors made minuscule by the nature around them. Like most scenes in the film, this was shot only once. There was neither time nor money for retakes, meaning everyone had to be perfect in order for Herzog to achieve his impossible vision. Once in the jungle though, the real ordeal began. On their way down to the raging banks of the Rio Urubamba, they slashed their way through dense brush and deep mud that held them back at every step. In one shot, you can even see Herzog's hand reaching out to stabilize a litter just before it topples. In another moment, Herzog accidentally grabbed onto a tree swarming with fire ants. Instantly, he lashed out with his machete, causing hundreds to rain down on him, biting him all over, their venom leaving him incapacitated for days with an extreme fever. What's more, food was very scarce in the jungle, and Herzog would eventually find himself trading away his watch and even his boots to local tribes in exchange for fish just to feed his massive expedition. All the meanwhile, Kinski's antics were only adding to the misery, throwing tantrums whenever he wasn't the center of attention.
Sie kommen mir sofort wie Gründen vom Film immer sagen, der hat wohl Schiss davor, deswegen macht das nicht. Und das, wenn Sie einen Erregten haben wollen, dann lassen Sie ihn erregt sein. Und sonst sagen Sie, er ist nicht erregt. Gut, ja, kann ja. Also! Aber ich möchte nicht zu sehr. Also drehen wir es jetzt! Ja, ich möchte nur nicht... Los, machen Sie die Kamera und drehen den Scheißdreck runter! Die Kamera dreht jetzt nicht. Ich spiele es jetzt so, wie ich will und aus! Gut, ja, aber wir müssen natürlich wissen... Endlich aufhören können, mit Ihre Hausfrauenanweisungen zu geben! Sorgen Sie dafür, dass eine Szene... Sie sind kein Regisseur! Sie müssen bei mir lernen! Nein, natürlich lerne ich nicht. Sie sind ein Anfänger! Natürlich bin ich... Ein Zwergenregisseur sind Sie, aber nicht ein Regisseur für mich! Jetzt beleidigen Sie mich besser. Beleidigen? Die Szene hier. Beleidigen? Sie können mich gar nicht mehr beleidigen, als dass Sie mir Regieanweisungen geben! Allein das ist ja eine Beleidigung! Sie können jetzt zu mir kommen und sagen, Herr Kinski, glauben Sie, auch David Lean hat das gemacht und auch Brecht und Sie werden es auch tun, mein Lieber. Werde ich nicht tun.
Ja, heute kann ich da natürlich drüber lachen, aber damals war das natürlich ernst und war eigentlich gar nicht lustig.
Herzog, on the other hand, was proving himself to be just as much of a megalomaniac, demanding the party use rudimentary rafts to voyage down the Rio Huaga just as Aguirre would have over 400 years ago. After just a single test run with local oarsmen, the cast was ordered aboard with some hesitation. Luckily, the locally built rafts performed quite well for the most part, though there were certainly some close brushes in the river's rough waters. Additionally, one of the rafts became trapped in a whirlpool. As it spun around endlessly, the actors on board began to vomit from their dizziness, and the raft itself started to be pulled apart. Rescue required throwing ropes down from the cliffs above, hauling each person up individually. Here, Herzog faced another brush with death, almost slipping on the sheer cliffside into the whirlpool which would have undoubtedly sucked him underwater to his death. Furthermore, with their camp located on the opposite bank, just to reach the cliffs, they needed to set up a wire crossing for the crew and equipment. In every instance where this was necessary, Herzog himself would take on the most dangerous task of swimming across the river to set up the crossing, using just a soccer ball as a buoy to keep himself afloat. Remarkably, despite the dangers, everything had gone more or less according to plan, and everyone sailed in for a much-needed rest at the end of a very busy day filming.
Are gone.
January 8th. Overnight, the river has risen 15 feet. When will our misfortunes cease?
The expedition awoke to catastrophe. Overnight, the river had risen by more than 15 feet, bursting its banks and completely engulfing their filming location. All the rafts were gone, swept away by the torrent, and much of their equipment had vanished along with them. Even the hefty cannon they brought as a prop was nearly lost, found half sunken in the riverbed. Everything was ruined. For most filmmakers, this might have been the end, but Herzog wouldn't let his dream die here. In fact, this twist was just what he needed. Mirroring the mounting tension in his story, he made the loss of the rafts the inciting incident for the division of the conquistadors into two factions, those that insisted on rebuilding the rafts and continuing downstream, and those who simply wished to give up and return to their masters. Just as Aguirre in the film refuses to give up, Herzog continued to mirror his determination and continued the production, rebuilding the rafts and traveling downstream to arrive in an abandoned village on the riverbank. After purchasing the huts from their previous owners, Herzog set them ablaze in an uncontrolled fire so that he might authentically depict a raid on the cannibal village. To further add authenticity to the scene, they would bring in a human mummy, a real one. This is a genuine corpse, and I have no idea where they got it from. All we know is that Herzog's brother found it and brought it in by plane, giving it a seat of its own due to its fragile condition, in a move that likely wouldn't go down so well today. Anyways, in the staged attack, the chaos of the scene began to spill into real life when the hungry extras discovered some food left in the abandoned village, rushing forward to claim it. Enraged by their lack of professionalism, Kinski drew his sword and swung as hard as he could at the head of the nearest extra. The impact left a massive dent in the genuine steel helmet, and even with that protection, this extra, Justo Gonzalez, was left bleeding profusely with a massive gash in his forehead. Without the helmet, Kinski would surely have split his skull. To this day, Gonzalez bears a prominent scar from the incident, and on that same evening, after narrowly escaping Kinski's wrath once, his life would be threatened once again. Kinski lived a truly privileged lifestyle, while the rest of the cast and crew drank river water and lived together in cramped, sweltering conditions. Kinski lived alone in a special hut with regular speedboat deliveries of mineral water just to keep him satisfied. Every night, the extras would drink and play cards, getting into massive brawls that left him with plenty of split lips and missing teeth that can actually be seen here in the film. To rectify this, Herzog ended up resorting to actually killing off the characters of particularly problematic extras just so they could be sent home early. But even the toughest of extras was scared of Kinski, and that fear wasn't unfounded. On the night of the attack on the cannibal village, Kinski became particularly irate over the noise coming from an extra's hut where over 45 people were cramped together. Determined to assert his dominance and prove himself a tough guy, Kinski grabbed his Winchester rifle and in quick succession fired 3 shots through the hut's wall. Miraculously, despite the cramped conditions, nobody was killed. However, one unfortunate extra did have his finger blown off, and in the ensuing chaos, Herzog confiscated Kinski's weapon. But that was the limit of his punishment. After all, he was the film's star, and the film took precedence over anything else. As shooting progressed, the crew continued to the Rio Nanai, which had flooded for miles inland, making it completely impossible to ever land the rafts. Therefore, for weeks, they were forced to live entirely on the water, relying on the rafts shown in the film, as well as additional house rafts trailing far behind. In fact, these support rafts can be very briefly glanced in this one shot in the finished film. Even the Emperor's outhouse shown in the film became their real outhouse during this time. Life on the water was relentless, and the rafts quickly became overgrown with moss and algae, turning their surfaces dangerously slippery. Mice infested the rafts, just as shown in the film, and their equipment grew increasingly battered and corroded. At one point, the roof of the main raft was entirely ripped off after a collision with overhanging trees on the riverbank. Everything was falling apart, and unknown to the cast and crew, the film itself was also breaking down. You see, halfway into the shoot, the existing footage so far had been shipped to Mexico for processing, but it never arrived at its destination, and Herzog was given the news that the entire film so far had been lost. At this news, Herzog had no possible reason to continue filming. On his remaining budget, he couldn't possibly remake the lost footage, nor could he go ahead and finish the film without its first half. Instead, in a move he now recognizes as insane, he prevented the news from reaching anyone other than him and his producer brother. he would keep everyone else oblivious and stubbornly see the project to its end, even though he knew that logically speaking, at its end he would be leaving Peru a failure, broke and with an incomplete film. Meanwhile, to coax the performances he wanted out of Kinski, Herzog employed a dangerous strategy. He would intentionally provoke the madman into fits of rage. He would let Kinski scream for hours until he was completely burnt out. Only then, when Kinski was simmering with resentment, would he turn the camera on to capture the raw intensity that defined his portrayal of Aguirre. At one point though, Kinski had finally had enough. After forgetting his lines, Kinski would fly into one of his famous tantrums, blaming the assistant cameraman for smiling and throwing him off. He demanded that Herzog fire the cameraman immediately or he would leave the production. But both individuals were integral to the film, and so Herzog of course refused. In response, Kinski resolved to leave and began packing all his belongings into a speedboat. This was no idle threat. Kinski had walked away from at least 50 contracts in the years prior, including his Jesus tour, to be there. But Herzog refused to let it end this way and knew exactly how to deal with him.
Und ich wusste, hat schon 30, 40, 50 Mal Verträge gebrochen vorher. Kurz vorher hat eine Tournee abgebrochen. Kurz davor Theaterengagements platzen lassen. Und ich wusste, er geht jetzt. Und da ging ich zu ihm und ganz ruhig, ich war im Übrigen unbewaffnet. Er hat später auch den Vorfall dann versucht abzuändern, um etwas besser auszusehen. Ich ging zu ihm hin und sagte, das geht nicht. Der Film ist wichtiger als unsere persönlichen Gefühle und ist wichtiger als überhaupt unsere Personen. Und das erlaubt sich nicht. Das geht nicht. Und er sagte, nein, ich fahre jetzt. Und ich sagte ihm, ich habe ein Gewehr, zwar nicht hier. Er würde höchstens die nächste Flussbiegung erreichen. Und da würde er 8 Kugeln durch den Kopf haben. Und die 9. wäre für mich. Und er hatte aber Instinkt genug zu wissen, das war jetzt kein Spaß mehr. Und da schrie er wie ein Wahnsinniger nach der Polizei. Der nächste Polizeiposten war allerdings mindestens 450 Kilometer entfernt. Später in der Presse wurde dann kolportiert, ich hätte ihn von hinter der Kamera mit angelegtem Gewehr dirigiert nur noch. Das stimmt natürlich nicht, aber er war die letzten Drehtage sehr, sehr diszipliniert.
Finally, for the iconic ending scene of Aguirre, Kinski was placed alone on a raft with over 400 monkeys, a surreal and unforgettable scene. But where on earth did Herzog acquire 400 monkeys? Well, Herzog's idea was to hire hunters in the city of Iquitos, paying them only half upfront to ensure they delivered. But instead of running off with his money, they ran off with the monkeys, selling them a second time to a company in Miami. In a dramatic showdown, Herzog found them being loaded onto a plane at Iquitos airport and in a moment of inspiration ran onto the runway, screaming that the monkeys didn't have the correct vaccination documents. Posing as a vet, he was able to convince the airport workers to sheepishly unload their precious cargo. Herzog then loaded them onto a truck, drove them to the river, and unpacked them onto speedboats for transport to the raft. During the climactic final scene, you can see many of the monkeys leap off the raft and swim to freedom. What the audience doesn't see, however, is the unseen struggle of Herzog and the other extras, silently enduring biting attacks from the remaining monkeys as a distraction to keep Kinski focused on his performance. At the end of filming though, the monkeys were all released into the wild, their captivity over at last. The same could be said for the cast and crew. Free at last from the jungle's grip, the treacherous rivers, the endless fights, and from Herzog's oppressive rule. Despite all the chaos, the nightmare was finally over, and after a couple stressful weeks, their missing footage would be found too, in a customs office in Lima having never even left for Mexico. And after weeks of painstaking editing and dubbing, Herzog's vision was finally manifest. In an inspired choice, he chose to dedicate it all to the extra hombrecito. Herzog first chanced upon Hombrecito playing his flute in the main square of Cusco, and when asked to join the crew, he initially refused, believing wholeheartedly that if he wasn't there every single day to play his flute, all the people of Cusco would die. In time, he was convinced to come along, but it was his single-minded devotion to his own completely delusional idea that fascinated Herzog, who saw in him a direct parallel to his Aguirre. Yet, in crafting his film, Herzog didn't just portray the folly of such doomed obsessions. At the same time, he created a parallel story, that of his own journey, of how one man's unrelenting vision, which defied all logic and expectation, succeeded against seemingly insurmountable odds. Now, having fought the harsh realities of the world and emerged victorious, what else was there to do but achieve the impossible all over again?
Ein Zeitpunkt kommen, wo man
At the age of 37, German filmmaker Werner Herzog has a worldwide reputation as one of the most talented directors to come out of the movement known as the New German Cinema. In 1977, he ventured deep into the upper Amazon jungle of Peru, scouting locations for a surrealistic adventure film he'd been planning for years, Fitzcarraldo. From the beginning, he expected it to be an extremely difficult project, but it wouldn't be the first time he'd risked everything for new images. In 1971, for instance, he came to the upper Amazon to film Aguirre, Wrath of God, and he and his crew spent weeks living on rafts in the middle of the river. Some critics feel that Herzog seeks out physical danger to test himself. Herzog insists he's a professional taking reasonable risks to create images no one has ever seen before. This time, however, the dangers were so extreme that he invited filmmaker Les Blank to shoot a documentary of Fitzcarraldo being made, as if he were afraid that the documentary might be the only record of his epic adventure. Join with Herzog, Klaus Kinski, and 800 Peruvian Indians as they risk their lives and their sanity.
What are your plans when this movie is all over? What are you going to be doing?
I shouldn't make movies anymore. Should go to a lunatic asylum right away.